Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the lecture series for different implementation of cybersecurity fundamental concepts. In this video, we are going to be discussing about port scanning, and we will talk about how or what is the purpose of port scanning with respect to cybersecurity, why it is important, what are some of the practical implementations or implications of using port scanning in the cybersecurity domain. And then we will look into a very simple port scanning script that we will implement using Python that we can use for our own testing purposes to understand how port scanning essentially works. So before we dive into these different topics, first we have to talk a little bit about the ethics and legality of port scanning. Okay, port scanning is not a harmless operation, depending on how you use it. You would need permission, and it is a matter of cybercrime legality that you should not perform port scanning on any network or system without their permission, right? So if it belongs to a particular organization of some individual, you should not carelessly just use these port scannings, right? So it is illegal and it is considered unethical if you perform any sort of unauthorized port scanning. So please keep this in mind that whatever you're going to be learning in this video and even writing your own simple port scanning script, you should not use it in any other network where you do not have any permission or against anybody's system, okay? You must make sure that you should use this responsibly. And if you do use it, then the goal of performing port scanning is either with respect to, let's say, you are considering carrying out some sort of a security testing operation, you are performing network scanning in order to find out the different vulnerabilities on your network, or if you're carrying out some sort of a ethical hacking operation, then that is only when you should use port scanning or tools that can enable port scanning. Another thing that you have to keep in mind that firewalls and any other security software that may be present in a system or a network are also capable of blocking and filtering port scanning attempts. So this is something that you should be aware of, which is basically if you do everything right with respect to port scanning and it still doesn't work, then maybe a firewall or a security software is blocking your attempts and filtering them when you are trying to perform port scanning, right? So these are some of the things that you have to keep in mind. And again, this is similar to our previous video, which was about SQL injection attacks, that these are only for educational purposes or to improve our own standing, to further improve the security of a system or a network. And it should not be used in any illegal or unethical manner. Okay. All right. So what is port scanning, right? So and why should we use port scanning? So port scanning typically is basically you are running a type of service which kind of looks at an IP address that could be of a system or of an entire network, and then you're trying to identify the ports that are open, which is basically the location where services are open to receiving requests from the outside world with respect to whatever the client requests are, right? So that means that if you're using a web application, and if you have a web server that is running on your system, then you would have an open port, which is running at some specific numerical port number that would be, listening to different requests that are coming from the client. And once those requests are received on that particular port, it gets forwarded to that service, right? So that is essentially how we establish connectivity across different, isolated networks or between different systems so that the services can be enabled and they can work properly, right? So why we need port scanning? Well, one of the many first reasons, and these why we are trying to answer it from the perspective of its implication to cybersecurity and not like enabling services and their communication. So with respect to cybersecurity, the reason why we can rely on port scanning responsibly is, first of all, of course, we can identify the open ports and services. And if we identify the open ports and services as, let's say, a network security administrator, we have an understanding of the attack surfaces, right? And as we had discussed at the very first few chapters when we were discussing these topics, what attack surfaces are, they are basically the potential entry points to any system or network, right? So if your system or network does not have any open ports, then it becomes, I wouldn't say completely impossible to access it, but it becomes like significantly more difficult in order to gain entry into the system using network operations, right? Uh, it also gives you an idea of active services. So a few moments ago, like I mentioned, the example of an HTTP web server. So if you run a port scan and if you find that port is open on port number 80, that essentially will imply that an HTTP web server is running on that particular port and it's receiving unencrypted web traffic, right? So these are some of the ideas that you can get if you run a port scanning application. So once you get an idea about these open ports, your attack surfaces, you can assess the vulnerabilities that are present to your system or to your network. And that can be done by detecting any kind of misconfigurations with respect to the ports. So that means you have an open port, but you don't have proper security controls that are in place to protect the services that is enabled by that particular open port, right? You can also identify any sort of outdated or vulnerable services that are running and close those ports, or otherwise patch those particular ports, right? So those are some of the operations that you can do when you run port scanning. You can also perform different operations to further strengthen the security of your system or your network in the form of executing penetration testing or red teaming, which is known as offensive security, right? So in situations like this, the goal is for the team to essentially simulate attack scenarios in an ethical fashion, right? So that is done. The first step for that is to basically check for the different ports that are open and what services they are running, right? You can use port scanning to detect unauthorized services that are running on your system or network. You can even monitor malicious scanning. So there are different security systems like intrusion detection systems, which are essential for detection activities on your network or on your systems. And these security systems, these IDS, can be configured to detect any unauthorized attempt at port scanning as well, right? And if they are detected, they can be configured to thwart those different types of activities. So eventually, you can use these operations, these 4 different steps that we discussed till this point, in order to perform risk management and make sure that you are compliant with respect to the industry standards and any type of time-to-time security audits that needs to be performed for your organization. That can be done using this particular process, right? So you can identify the open ports, you can prioritize your defenses, make sure that you are compliant to all the regulations that are in place. And then whenever audits are required, you can perform those audits using port scanning by showing that, these are the services that are running on these particular ports and you have them configured properly and stuff like that, right? So that is basically why we would want to have port scanning in our utility belt or in our tool in order to strengthen the defenses of our system or network, right? In terms of practicality, there are various options that stems from the operation of port scanning. So the first one is called blue teaming, which is also known as defensive security. And the whole idea behind blue teaming is that you continuously monitor your networks to ensure that only the necessary ports are open and that they are configured properly, and hence they are secure. You also have red teaming, which is known as offensive security, which uses the process of port scanning to basically identify the weaknesses in a system or a network, right? And then develop security measures in order to patch them. You can also use port scanning for incident response. So, which essentially means that after a security breach has taken place, you can use port scanning to find the vulnerable services that led to the particular incidents. And if they are still running, you can stop them, you can patch them, you can close them, right? And that way you can respond to a particular incident once you have evidence of that particular incident, okay? Keep in mind, people do not generally write their own port scanning program or script from scratch. there are many well-known tools that are available for performing the operations of port scanning. And again, please keep in mind that you should not use these tools without permission or in an unethical fashion, right? So you got to keep that in mind. So you have different tools like the Nmap network mapper. It's one of the most popular tools for port scanning. A variant of the Nmap network mapper is basically the Zenmap, which gives you a graphical user interface on top of Nmap. And there are many, many different more like Netcat, Unicorn Scan, Angry IP Scanner. And if you search the web, you can find all these tools. So if you're ever in a position where you're going to perform these ethical activities, right, you can make use of these tools, right? But our goal is to understand on a fundamental level, because this series is about understanding the implementation of various fundamental cybersecurity operations, right, or security softwares and systems and stuff like that, right? So our goal is to see that, okay, if we are to write our own port scanning tool, how would we do that, right? And we want to do that essentially using Python. So the prerequisite is we need to use a library for that will enable the process of port scanning. That is known as the socket library, right? So that allows us to kind of attempt to establish connection on various sockets that are open, which are AKA ports, right? So that will enable us to use some of the inbuilt methods that are present in this library. And this is an inbuilt library, so you don't have to install it as an external dependency, right? And we will be exclusively implementing and testing our port scanning on our personal systems, okay, where we have the permission, so we can give ourselves the permission to do it just for testing purposes, or even out of curiosity, if you want to check what is happening on your own system, then you can use this program, or you can use it on your own home network. So remember, unless and until that is your own home network, please do not run the port scanning on a network level, okay? And then we will be using only IPv4 addresses, okay, and not IPv6 addresses. And the program is going to be in contrast to some of the previous programs that we have, done up until now. It's going to be pretty, straightforward and simple in nature, right? And of course, that is owing to this socket library. If this was not present, then of course that will overcomplicate the implementation. So the program is going to be very straightforward. It will have a user input, and the user is going to provide input with respect to the target IP address that we want to scan. Now, again, the target IP address could be in the form of a singular system, or it could be in the form of a network IP address. So that means you can provide the IP address of a router and stuff like that. You will provide a port number range to scan. So that means you will have a starting port number. So you can say something like 1, and then you can have an ending port number. So you can say something like 1000. So if you check all the ports that might exist between that. So let's say, for example, port 80 is one port between 1 to 1000. So if port 80 is running and you provide the input of 1 to 1000, then of course, this program will spit the output that, this port is open, it is running because I was successfully able to establish connection with this particular port, right? So the overall output of the program is essentially going to be the list of open ports that are present in within the specified port range for that particular target IP address, right? So that's all we have with respect to the program logic, right? There isn't anything complicated. We don't have multiple functions either. We're going to have like probably just a singular function, which is essentially the port scanning itself, and a main function to fire up our program. So let us switch to Visual Studio Code and let us start working on our port scanning implementation, okay? So give me a moment to set up the share here. Okay, so you should be able to see my Visual Studio Code editor at this point of time. So what I have done up until this point is I have created a new subdirectory inside the primary cybersecurity fundamentals directory. And by the way, all of these codes are again available on my GitHub repository with the repository name of cybersecurity fundamentals. So if you ever want to check out these codes, you can access them on my GitHub repository. under the repository name of Cybersecurity Fundamentals, and you will find all these directories that you see here on my workspace on my local system here. So I have created a subdirectory and I've called it port scanner. Okay, so I've created this subdirectory, and then within that subdirectory, I've created a Python script file, which has the same name as the subdirectory, which is port_scanner.py, right? And that's it. And then now we can start working on this particular program. So the first thing is we need to import the libraries, right? So we need only one library here that needs to be imported, and that is known as the socket library, which enables operations with ports and sockets. So that is simply going to be SOCKET, right? So that is the only import that we need. And now we have to essentially draw the roadmap of our program. So we will have two specific functions. The first function is essentially going to be about the main port scanning operation. All right. And the second function is going to be our main function. And the main function, let us write this down first because it is pretty straightforward, will require user input. And of course, the main function will fire up the program as well, but it will need user input. So we will take 3 user inputs as we discussed a while back. So the first one is going to be what we call as the target IP. So we call that target_IP. We will need a starting port range. So we will say start port, something like this, or you can name it something better. And we will need an ending port number, right? So these are the 3 inputs, and we need to store that, store in a variable, store in respective variables. Okay. And then we need to call the port scanning function by passing the variables of the previous step as input to the function, something like this, right? And now once we receive this, or once we get into this first function, which is for port scanning, we essentially have to use the library, use the socket library, like, okay. And then what we want to do using that library is try to establish a connection with all the ports enumerated between the range of the start port, which was given as an input by the user, and the end port. Okay, so we want to check this, and if a connection was successfully established, which essentially means that the port is open, then we report that port number. Okay, and we repeat the previous 2 steps until we have finished scanning the range of port numbers. Okay, so that is like the overall logic of what we want to implement. Of course, there are certain nuances within this function that I will address, which requires a call to certain inbuilt methods within the socket library. So that will basically make sure that we are able to perform these operations. So like when I say try to establish, that means we have to call certain methods within the socket library that will enable us to actually make that call. So this is more like an overall logic, and then we will get into the actual implementation and see how that essentially works, right? So let's start with the program then. So I will first write the main method. So we will write the main method first. So if the name of the file is called, then that is going to be treated as the main function. So essentially what needs to be done after that is we want to get an input from the user. So we will call the input method and we will give a prompt and we will say enter the target IP address that you want to scan. Okay, so we'll put something like this. And now once we receive an input from the user, this needs to be assigned to a variable. So we will call that variable as target IP. All right. Now we will repeat this process, but we will do it for the next two inputs that we need. So I will copy this line of code. I'll paste it twice, and I will change the name of my variables. So here, I will name this as start port. I think that's what I named it. Yeah, start port. And then the next one will be end port. And here, instead of saying enter the target IP address, here we will say enter the starting port number. And here we will say, let's copy this. Okay. And here we can just replace this prompt. And we can say enter the ending port number. Okay. So this is basically the range of port numbers that we want to scan, right? So we can perform like a loop operation from the first port number to the very last port number, and we will check one at a time as to like what is happening, right? So basically, this will be a very simplistic loop operation over the range of port numbers. All right. You can make this static, but remember, port numbers can range from single double digits like 80, 22, and it can go all the way up till 5 digits, right? So for example, services like MongoDB and stuff like that, they have a 5-digit port number, right? Many services have 4-digit port number, like database, other data, relational database services, right? So if you give a very big range, this program is going to take a good amount of time as well, right? It's not a very, very fast process. Although if you use some of the ready-made tools that I mentioned, some of those tools are lightweight and they are fast. So people generally rely on that rather than writing this. But again, the purpose here is to understand how it works essentially, right? How it is implemented. So that's why we are doing it from scratch, right? So once this is done, the next step will be to call the port scanning function. So yeah, for that, we need to first define the prototype of our port scanning function. So here we will say define the prototype of the port scan function, something like this. So we will write a function here. So we will say def, we'll give it a name. Let's call it port scan. It will have the opening and closing first parenthesis. And here we will just say pass. We'll come back to this. And this function will take 3 inputs. And these 3 inputs are basically this, this, and this, right? So what we are going to do here is now we will call that function itself, and we will pass in as input arguments these 3 parameters, right? So target IP, comma, start port, comma, end port. Okay, so that takes care of the function call, and we'll just essentially copy this line here. All right, and we will just paste it here right before this double colon or the colon that we have, right? So that takes care of the connectivity between the function call and the function definition here. And now we can start working on the port scanning. So first, what we can do is we can give like a simple prompt to the user that the scanning has started, right? So this is something we can do using a simple print statement, which is formatted. So we can say begin scanning target system or network with IP address, and then we will paste the target IP address that is being passed or specified by the user. So here we will say target IP address, give it some space, and then we need to call on a variable here. So we'll wrap it around the curly brackets or with the curly brackets. And then we will use the variable which has the value of the input that is given by the user. So that is taken care of. Now, once that prompt is given, what we can do next is we can start a loop that will go over one port number at a time, starting from the start value till end value plus 1. Okay, so for this, the best option would be to go with a for loop. So let's create a loop control variable. So let us name the loop control variable port. You can name whatever you want for this particular variable. And this port will be in the range of values which is starting from the start port. So essentially this guy here. Okay. And then it will go all the way up till the end port plus 1. Okay. So to include that. All right. So that is basically the setup of our for loop. We don't need this pass anymore. We can remove this guy so it does not create errors. All right. So what do we need to do inside of this? Okay. So inside of this, the first thing that we need to do is we need to create a socket object, right? And this socket object is basically an instantiation of this socket library, all right? So what this will help us to do is create this object that we can essentially use in order to establish the connections and call the various methods that help us establish those connections with these different port numbers that we are looping over, right? So first we need to initialize that socket object. The next thing that we want to do is we want to specify the address family. Okay. And once I write down the code, it will make sense what that address family means, right? And we want the address family to be basically the address family that the internet uses, right? So the communication protocol that the internet uses, which essentially is enabled by mostly by IPv4 IP addresses, right? So we need to specify that this socket object will work on IP addresses that belong to the IPv4 address family, which is essentially used by the internet, right? The next thing that we want to do is we want to specify the type of the socket as well. So we want to specify the type of the socket. So what this boils down to is essentially the protocol that is being used. Remember, in our discussions on the network security class, we discussed that there are two main types of transmission protocols that can be used, okay? So the first one is known as the TCP protocol, okay, which is basically the transmission control protocol. And then you also have the UDP protocol, which are essentially used for broadcast purposes and stuff like that, right? Whereas TCP is more suitable for like 1:1 network communication, right? System to system network communications and things like that. So here, we are not doing any broadcast stuff. So what we need to specify is that we want to use the TCP protocol here in trying to establish the connection to the port numbers that we will be scanning on the given target IP range. So the way we want to do that is something like this. So we want to call the socket library first, okay? And then use the dot operator in order to access the different methods that are written inside this particular library. Remember, library module is called module in Python essentially, but what this boils down to is somewhere there is a file that is having all of the different methods which can be used to access the different operationalities with respect to port operations or socket operations, right? So instead of writing all those codes from scratch, we are essentially importing that file to our program using the file name and then the dot operator. And then we are accessing all these inbuilt methods that are already, you can see here all the properties and the methods. So these are all the methods, the ones that you see with this cube. And these are all the properties that can be accessed that is present within that particular module, right? So the one that I want to use here is socket.socket, okay? And inside of this, I want to specify these 2 points. Specify the address family and then the type of socket in the form of two input parameters, right? So the first parameter that I'm going to be specifying that will specify that I want to use the IPv4 IP address family is by calling socket dot AF, and then we are looking for internet. Okay, so here it is internet. So you can see here, AF INET is basically the IPv4 part. And if you have guessed, the INET6 is the IPv6 family. So we don't want to do the IPv6 family. We want to do the IPv4 family. The next thing is we have to specify that we are only interested in the TCP protocol. So the TCP IP is the practical network model. We discussed that in the previous network security lecture classes, right? So in order to select that, again, we will call socket. And here we are looking for something which is sock stream. All right. So this is basically the part which establishes that we want to use TCP IP. Okay. And we want to instantiate this and store this in an object within our folder, in our program, right? So we are going to create that and we are going to name it as sock, okay? Or you can say socket, whatever. You can give it whatever name you want, as long as you can identify that this is the instance of this module, which will be used to establish the connection, all right? So now if connection is not established, then we want to set a timeout for that. So we will say socket set timeout, this one, all right? And then we will give it a value of 1, all right? Next, we want to make an attempt now that we have declared our socket object, which is stored inside sock, okay? We want to make, or we want to attempt to connect to the port number, which is specified in the current iteration of the for loop, all right? So in order to do that, there are many different ways, not many different ways. The main way that we essentially use is that we use this object, which is now an instantiation of this module, and we use a method called connect, right? So that is the typical way. So essentially, if we do something like this, sock.connect, so this will just try to establish the connection. So here, when we try to connect it, it needs two input parameters. One is the IP address that we are searching, which was given by as an input by the user. And then we need the current port number, which is being tracked by this loop control variable here, as it loops over all of the range of the IP, the port at that numbers that has been provided by the user. Now, the thing about this is that it will not satisfy our purpose. Our purpose is to report the port number. The fact is, if we use this connect method only, right, what will happen is if the program was unsuccessful in establishing a connection with this particular port number on this particular IP address, it will just, raise an exception, and then the connection would fail, right? And nothing will happen. So essentially, you wouldn't know if anything happened or not, right? It will just fail and move on, right? So nothing is going to essentially come out of it. So there is another option for connection. You can see here, if I press Control white space or space bar buttons on my keyboard, it gives me the suggestions that I have that I can use, right? So you can see the other one is called connect_ex. Now, the connect_ex is much suitable for this particular functionality is because if connection is successful, this connect.ex method, so we will say connect_ex returns 0. And if it is unsuccessful, if connection was unsuccessful, the connect_ex method returns some non-zero integer value, right? Rather than just simply raising an exception and then moving forward with the simple connect method, the connect_x method is going to tell us when the connection was successful. And that moment when the connection is successful, we can essentially extract that particular port number before we go on to the next port, right? So that means, let's say, in any hypothetical iteration of this for loop, let's say we are scanning port 50, We come here, we try to establish a connection, and it was successful in establishing the connection. So this particular operation here is going to return a value of 0. The moment we get 0, we know that for this port number, the connection was successfully established. So what we can do is we can print that port number. So that will enable the port scanning process essentially, right? So, and we want to save this 0 value that is being returned, right? So we will create a variable here and we will say result, okay, which will be stored inside this particular variable here. And if the result is a non-zero value, some non-zero integer value, then essentially what it means is that, you know, we were not able to successfully establish connection with that port. So that port number is not open. And as a result, we don't need to store that port number, and we can move on to the next iteration of the for loop and the next port number essentially, right? So here, what we want to do is we want to provide an input where the first input is going to be, of course, the target IP address, and the second input will be the current port number in the for loop, right? Whichever the for loop is going for. So this will return 0 if it was successful. And now what we need to do is we need to capture the port with which we successfully established a connection. All right. So that's a decision-making statement. So that means we will write an if-else loop, if-else statement. So we will say if result is 0, so that means connection has been successfully established. We need to print or prompt the users that, so we need formatting here. So we will say port number, and then we will write the port number that is open, which is the current iteration of the for loop, is open. Something like this, some message that you want to give. All right. And once all of these operations are done, we will close the connection that we had opened here. Remember, we are opening a socket connection with our program and that particular port number. So before we go to the next iteration of the for loop and try to open another connection, we will want to close the current connection that has been opened on line 28. So we are just going to call socket.close. Otherwise, if we have 1,000, 10,000 ports and we don't close it, then your program will try to have open connection with all of these different ports, and that will unnecessarily utilize your resources and slow down your program even further, right? So that essentially is the overall idea of the program. It's a pretty simple program. If you remove the comments here by understanding what it does, you can see that this function is not going to be that big, right? So let us double check what we have done here. So we imported the library. We created a main function, got 3 inputs from the user, which is the target IP address, the start port, the end port. And then we defined a function that is going to perform our primary operation of port scanning, which will again take the inputs of the IP address starting and ending port numbers. We run a for loop over the starting range, over the range of port numbers that was given as an input by the user. We first create a new instance of the socket module by specifying that we are going to be using the IPv4 address ranges and the TCP communication protocol. We set a timeout for that if it is going to establish the connection. And if it fails to give a connection, then we need to give it some time. Then we will try to establish a connection of our program with that particular port number by specifying the IP address and the port that we are currently scanning. If the scan was successful, a value of 0 will be returned by this method, which we will be storing in this temporary variable. We will check if the value of that temporary variable is 0. If it is 0, then essentially a successful connection was established. So we will basically document that port number in the terminal. And before we go and try the next port number, we are going to close the current connectivity that was opened, the current connection that was opened with that particular port, and then repeat this process until we reach the end of the loop, right? So that is it. That is there. That is all that is there with respect to port scanning. Now, to test it, right? Again, do not run this program anywhere where you do not have permissions to run the program, right? So where can you run this program? You can run this program on your own machine. You can run this program on your own home network, assuming you would want to do that, right? So one of the things, the two target IP addresses that you can essentially test is for your own system. The target IP address is essentially going to be your local host, right? And we discussed what the IP address of your local host is in the previous program when we were doing the SQL injection attack. We had to build a web server, right? So if we run this program, so I will show you one that I have already set up on my own system. I know that it is running temporarily for the purpose of the demo, right? So I will enter my IP address first, which for my own system is always going to be the default 127.0.0.1, right? This is always going to be the local host. And local host essentially means your own computer. Okay. Then we need to give a starting port number and an ending port number. So in order to simplify the process, you guys in your own time, if you're curious, you can try out a range of values, from 1 to 1000 if you have the time to sit through it and see what is going on your system. But for the sake of demo itself, I am going to use a specific port number range that is going to show a service that is running. So I have a database server that is running on my system for development purposes, testing purposes. That's all that database server does, right? To show demos, to test around new things and stuff like that, right? If I'm writing a web development program, I need something to prototype, I have that service running. So I have a MySQL server that is running, right? So I'm going to set up, and this is basically a quick quiz for all of you who's watching this. What is the default port number for a MySQL database server, right? So I'm going to start 3300, and I'm going to go all the way up till, let's see, 3310. Not too much, right? Just about 10 port. So let's run this. Okay. And I hit an error. So we have to solve this error, and let us see where the problem is. Okay. All right, so we have indications on line 41. So let's see what line 41 is. When I'm calling this particular function, okay, sweet. And then I have an indication on line 19. Line 19 is right here. Okay, so what am I missing here? And for port in range, and then the range value is there. We have the start port, we have the end port, +1. Okay, and then the for loop syntax looks good. Socket syntax looks good. And set timeout is good. All right, so what does the prompt say? So for port in range from start port can only concatenate strings and not int to strings. Okay, so there is a mismatch with respect to our data type that is throwing an error here. So let me pause this video, go the code real quick, and essentially try to find out the location where I have essentially tried to concatenate an integer value with respect to a string value. All right, so let me pause this, and once I find it, I will be back and let you know what the error essentially is. All right, I think I know what is happening based on the prompt that was given. So here it says it cannot concatenate the integer to the string value. So there is a type mismatch. So essentially what is happening is when I am taking the input here, and this, I think we had this problem before as well in one of my previous programs that we were doing. I don't remember which one, but I kind of have a deja vu feeling that I have made this mistake multiple times before as well. So why the mistake? The mistake is happening, the bug is coming essentially from the fact that this method is going to take input as a string. All right. However, when I pass this input, so let's simulate this, what is happening. This is a string, this is a string, this is a string, because that is what the nature of the input method is. It takes the input as a string and stores it as a string, all right? So that means all these three variables now have string data type. So this is string, this is string, this is string. It goes to this function. This we are printing it, and this is a string. So, the program really doesn't care. You are printing whatever data. Cool. It's not concerned with it. Comes here, and now this is a range of values, right? So that means this has to be a numerical value. And in addition to that, I'm going 1 over the range of the last numerical value. So remember, in string, if I use this plus operator, this essentially means a string concatenation. So that means essentially if I have a string A, and if I do plus B, which is another string, the output essentially, where did it go? Let me write it here so that it doesn't complain. So if I have a string, let's say string variable A, and if I have a string, let's say B, if I do A plus B, then the output will be AB. But I'm not trying to do this here in the line 23 for the for loop, right? I'm trying to I have a value, let's say, like the input that I gave was 3300 to 3310. I think that is the two values that I gave. So I want to treat this as a numerical value and this as a numerical value and then loop over it. However, since the input has been taken as a string, if I do anything like that, first of all, it cannot loop over the string values because it expects this guy here expects this and this to be numerical values, which is basically integer values, right? Secondly, if I do 3310 plus 1, which is what this operation is, if this is a string, this is a numerical value, it is going to throw a mismatch error, which is what this is telling us, that it can only concatenate string to string and not into string, where this is expected to be an integer value, right? So the location where the problem is happening then is essentially before, what we can do is before we send this input to the function and we store this value into this variable, instead of this variable saying that it is a string, we want to have this variable say that it stores integer value. So the way so I will write a quick note here. When you take a data type, when you have a data type and you want to convert that to another data type, we call that casting, right? Typecasting. Essentially, we call that as typecasting, which is the process of typecasting. So the way we are going to do the typecasting here is we are going to call the internal method to instantiate an integer value. So that is essentially just int. And we are going to wrap the string that is going to be resulting from this particular operation. And we're going to typecast that to int. And now you can see that this variable now says int. It doesn't say string anymore, right? So we're going to do that same thing for the next guy as well. And let's try this again and see if this resolves the error, or are we looking at something different. So we will come here, run the program again. I'll give my own system's IP address. So I'll say 270.0.1. I'll start my port number at 3300, and I will have an end port number at 33, let's do 10. Okay, so that doesn't give the error anymore. So that means the for loop has started. And you can see here that I got one port number that was open and nothing else was open, because in that range of 3300 to 3310, the only database service that runs is basically the MySQL server, okay? And that runs at a default port of 3306. Now, I will give you certain port numbers. You can try it out on your own computer or on your own home network, okay? But don't try this at your university network. If you live in a dorm or stuff like that, there are certain specific use case instances that you should not try, okay? So I will just give the list of test cases that you will use, test cases to use for screenshot submission. Okay, and this screenshot submission will be private. So nobody will be able to see this, right? Other than, of course, me, just to make sure that I can see what is going on. So some of the operations that you can do is there are certain services that run at 22, 25 port numbers and stuff like that. So what you can do simply to simplify the process, try these. Only execute. So I will write this again. Only execute on your own system or your own home network and nowhere else. All right. So you can give the IP address as 127.0.0.1. So that's your local system. And you can try a port number from 1 to, let's say, 1024. You can try this much, right? So that will cover all of the important port numbers like secure shell. If you're using that, if you're using secure file transfer, I'm guessing most of you wouldn't be using it, but if it is running from a different class and stuff like that, it will show up. You can also, what you can do, a fun thing that you can do is you can run the SQLi attack demo program. You can keep this program running. You can open a separate terminal and then run port scanner. And then you can see that the web server from Flask, which I believe has around a range of like 5,000 or something. So you will probably have to increase this to 7,000 or something like that to encompass it. But it will essentially run pretty good. The other thing that you can run, and this is specific to your home network only, if you want to scan your home network, what you can do is you can give the IP address of your router. Typically speaking, IP address of your router is 192.168.1.1, right? So you can run this and you can give any arbitrary value of port numbers for this, and you can test it out what is running. Yeah, and that is what you can use in order to test out the program and then take the screenshots. Okay, but again, to remind everybody, and I keep on saying this because it is important, do not execute this program other than on your own system or on your own home network. Okay, do not run this on the university's domain. Do not run this on anybody else's computer, right? Because it is illegal and it is unethical, right? So there are security softwares that will be running to see any type of malicious attempts for port scanning. And if you do this, they will flag your IP address. Okay, so don't try this at home. Well, you cannot say that don't try this, because only try this at home. Okay, so that's like no pun intended, but that was, anyways. All right, so that is it for this programming demo. And in the next programming video, we are going to be looking at how to write the script for configuring our own firewall. So stay tuned for that. I will see you all in the next video.